Today we're going to start on topic 5. Um, I'm just looking at the date today, and it is Wednesday, February 9th. And just in terms of where we're at, before I get into topic 5, I'm just going to say my plan, and we'll see where we are on Friday, but my plan is topic 5 and topic 6 are not as long as the carbohydrate topic. And so my plan is to hopefully have topic 5 and 6 done before the midterm. And they would be included on the midterm. Either way, the midterm is basically a week and a half from now. It's on the 18th of February. And I'm not going to say anything more about it today, but I am going to talk about it on Friday. I'm hoping to have a lot more information for you on Friday in terms of just putting together a study package and whatnot. So stay tuned on that, and we'll talk about the midterm on Friday. But today we are going to talk about lipids. So let's talk about lipids. There's so much that could be said about these things again as well in so many different aspects of this. We obviously want to talk about how they are involved in our health. And once again, you're going to see that a lot of the science is kind of complicated. So I'm not sure if I'm going to get through all of this today. Like I said, this topic is a lot shorter than the carbohydrate topic, but we'll see where we get. And we're going to start off just kind of talking about lipids in terms of what they're used for and what they are, kind of on a very basic chemical basis. One thing that you probably know about lipids is that they are energy rich. And lipids, by the way, lipids, fats, I'm going to probably use the words interchangeably. They kind of mean the same thing. One of the things for me with my background in biochemistry is sometimes in biochemistry, there's very specific definitions for things. But in nutrition and kind of broad use, a lot of words are used a little bit more interchangeably, or sometimes they might mean one thing in one context and another thing in another context. So fat, for example, fats often mean solid things like butter and fat on meat. But they don't have to. That's kind of just the common way to use it, right? So fats and lipids, we're going to use somewhat interchangeably. So just keep that in mind. You can see here is showing and reminding us some of the stuff we learned way back in week 1 about the amount of energy found in the different macronutrients. And so carbohydrates and proteins are 4 calories per gram, whereas fats are 9 calories per gram. And they're showing this in this picture here, showing that you've got 2 lunches there. One is carbohydrate rich, the other is fat rich. And you see that the fat rich lunch is much smaller because the calories are kind of more dense and packed in there. I'm just going to pause this for a second. I didn't close my door here. There's a bit of noise going on in my house. Hold on a second. Hopefully that's better. Not sure if you guys were hearing it, but I certainly was. So let's talk about what fats are doing, right? The big thing is that they're energy. They're an energy source, and they are an energy storage mechanism. And we're going to talk about both of those things. And it's important to note, and it's important to emphasize, that fat does have an important role in a balanced diet. In fact, some fats are essential for our bodies. That means our body cannot make it itself, and we have to rely on it in the diet. And they're also required. They're going to help us to absorb vitamins, for example, fat-soluble vitamins. We'll talk about vitamins in a couple of weeks. And like I said, the big one is energy. So you can see in this case here, here's an example of a couple of common fats people might have around their house: butter and olive oil. And if you look at this, a serving size is 1 tablespoon. So 1 tablespoon is about 120 calories. That's pretty energy dense. So this is kind of a theme around fats in terms of, the whole idea around moderation, which is something we're definitely going to get into at some point here today. But like I said, lots and lots of uses for fats. Energy is kind of the number one that everyone thinks about. And but in terms of what's going on in the body, they're an emergency reserve. Fats actually pad and insulate our organs. So if you're into any kind of sport, right? Think about it. You're jumping. Let's say you do a ski jump, or you're going in for a shot in basketball or something like that. You're jiggling your whole body around, and you've got organs in there that want to be protected. And it turns out that fat is actually around there protecting a lot of them. Temperature insulation is another good one. We don't necessarily think about that. We kind of giggle and laugh about it in the winter, saying, hey, it's not too bad putting on a few pounds. But in some organisms, it's actually essential. Beluga whales, for example, are a good example of a mammal that lives in colder waters, and the blubber is helping to keep them warm. Bears eat a lot of food and try to build up their fat so that they can hibernate and so on. Fats are raw materials for all sorts of things in the bodies. If we need to make cholesterol, we'll talk about cholesterol later. We need to make some vitamins and things like that are all kind of essential. In food, fats are good, and from my perspective, I think about how fats, they make some foods taste really good, right? Compare your low-fat, low-fat yogurts versus high-fat yogurts, for example. A lot of low-fat yogurts, in my mind, just taste terrible. The ones with the high fat, they taste amazing, right? So that's one thing about it, right? Fats are good, and our bodies are designed to enjoy the taste of fats. Obviously, usually we're not consuming pure fat, but as part of a food, it can actually make it taste good. And it can contribute to, I can never say this word properly here, satiety, and that kind of means, satisfaction, right? In terms of if I ate a bowl of, let's say, celery, it might be a nice snack, but after that, I'm not necessarily feeling satisfied, right? Whereas eating a bowl of ice cream, you eat that and it's like, that was pretty good. And you're feeling satisfied. Your body responds to these things, and everyone's bodies respond to these differently. You can train your body to respond positively or negatively to fats and sugars and things like that. But there's a lot that could be said about fats in foods. And can't really say I'm an expert chef or anything like that, but I know when you watch the cooking shows, they talk about, using the right proportions and, marbled meats and those kind of things, and how that contributes to the taste and the sensory and all those kind of things. So anyway, I'm not going to say anything more about that. And I'm sure everybody has their own opinions on how fats can contribute to foods and or make them maybe even in some cases taste less appealing. Here's just a little bit more about fat in the body. We did talk about this a little bit already. We talked about adipose tissue, and that's kind of a fancy name for fat tissue. And this is, of course, a massive reserve of energy in our bodies. And, we store a little bit of energy in glycogen and other things, but much of the energy in our bodies is stored as fat. So if you take a look at this diagram on the right here, it's showing how a lot of us store fat. And this is basically under the skin, right? So you can see that the top layer here is skin. So that's skin there. And then we have these fat tissue cells here. And if you look down at the bottom there, a fat cell is called an adipocyte. And so cyte means cell, by the way. And adipose, remember adipose tissue, adipocyte is a fat cell. And if you take a look, this is kind of just your general cell. If you know a lot about cell biology, it's got a nucleus, it's got a membrane, it's got all the organelles, and in the middle, it has a whole bunch of fat. So it's a cell basically designed to store fat. That's all it does. And it can release fat into the blood when we need it. It can store more fat when we have consumed in excess. Okay, so let's talk about lipids and lipid classification. This is one of these things where the textbook kind of says there's 3 types of lipids, and I don't really like how they classify them based on their chemistry and whatnot. And there's so many different types of classification schemes. And I'm not going to get into all the chemistry on this, just some very, very basic stuff. This is kind of one way how I see lipids in terms of their basic chemistry. There's technically other categories I could add on here as well. There's fat soluble vitamins and a few things like that are kind of fit in this category of lipids. But let's start off and talk about what exactly is a lipid. Okay, So a lipid, it says here, it's basically a compound that's insoluble in water and made mostly of carbon and hydrogen. So that's actually a really good definition of fat. You could almost add on to that a biological compound that's insoluble in water. Let me give you an example, petroleum. Petroleum is not a lipid. We don't eat it. It's not biologically functional in human bodies, but it does fit those other categories. It's insoluble in water, and it's made mostly of carbon and hydrogen. So anyway, this includes a huge variety of compounds. And you can see I have some of them listed here. We are going to talk about fatty acids. We're going to talk about triglycerides and phospholipids and steroids. We could talk about waxes and sphingolipids, but we're not going to get into all that. Waxes are important for all sorts of plants and body systems, and they're usually waterproofing and things like that, but we're not going to talk about that. The big one is this one here, the triglycerides. The triglycerides are basically 95% of the fat we eat, 95% of the fat we store in the body. So a huge, huge important group of fats. And often when people say fat, they usually are meaning triglyceride. So like I said, that's kind of used interchangeably. So when you take a look at these, you'll see, I'm going to show you some chemical structures, at least some basic chemical structures. And you'll see there's they're loaded with carbon and hydrogen. And if you know a little bit of chemistry, that's great. And I can certainly talk to you about it anytime. I found this graph here on the internet. I think I was going to actually show it later on in the lecture, but you can see this is just talking about vegetable oils. And anyway, we'll talk about vegetable oils a little bit later on. So let's talk about triglycerides. Vegetable oils, by the way, are mostly triglycerides. Maybe that's why I wanted to bring it up there. So triglyceride, let's take a look at the word. Tri means three, and glyceride means actually glycerol. And so, by the way, a lot of textbooks and other places abbreviate these as tags. I don't usually use tags. I usually just say triglycerides, usually not into acronyms so much. So I like to use the full word usually. And anyway, so let's take a look at this structure. And I just want to show you basically what is going on there. There's the glyceride part. That is a molecule of glycerol. Glycerol is kind of like a carbohydrate derivative. If you want to look it up, you can. Sometimes it's used as a food additive for various reasons, but I'm not going to get into that. And the tri part is that it's made out of glycerol plus 3 fatty acids. And that's kind of it. Now, the thing is about triglycerides is there is a huge variety of these things, partly because there's a huge variety in fatty acids. And if you look at the profile of organisms, so I'm talking about animals and plants, some of them food, some of them we're not eating necessarily, but every species and even cell types make their own characteristic kinds of triglycerides. And this has to do with their functions of the cell types and the tissues and genetics and those kind of things. And you can also affect the fats in your body by the fats in your diet as well, because of course, the triglycerides you eat may end up becoming triglycerides that are incorporated into your body. So for example, you can, and when we know this from livestock, right? You can feed a cow or a pig or a sheep or a chicken. You can feed them different foods and it may affect their meat or their products, right? So for example, I don't know a lot about dairy cattle, but apparently in different places in the world, dairy cows are fed different types of grains, and the fats in those grains can actually affect the taste and the texture and the hardness of the butter. So, you know, we definitely know that's a thing. You can think of a triglyceride as kind of a very basic structure like this. So here's my glycerol, and I'll make that a box like this, and then you can think of it as 3 fatty acids, kind of like this. So my structure on the right, so this is fatty acid 1, fatty acid 2, and fatty acid 3. So this is kind of important to know because we're going to be talking a lot about breaking these things down and consuming them, and we're going to talk a lot about fatty acids as well, by the way. So worth it to know a little bit about the structure You don't need to know the big complicated structure on the right, but that kind of simplified thing on the left is important. So I was talking a little bit about fats, right? And I told you one definition of fats is something that is usually solid or harder at room temperature. And since most of these things are going to be triglycerides, or a large percentage of these foods are going to be triglycerides, we got to think about triglyceride properties a little bit. And when we think about triglyceride properties, really, the big difference in all of them, if I go back to this, as I said, is these fatty acids. And there are many, many types of fatty acids. And this is something I want to kind of get in, talk to you a little bit about here. So if we look at these fatty acids, and some of them are solid at room temperature, and often we call these things fats. Some of them are liquidy at room temperature, and often we call these oils. Even though these words are often used somewhat interchangeably, that's kind of the common vernacular on these kind of things. So you can see some words here about the fatty acids, right? In terms of what makes them harder. Some of them are longer and saturated. I'll talk about that again in a minute. And the softer liquid ones are more unsaturated. And that's kind of a big distinguishing feature of the different kinds of fatty acids. And so I want to show you some fatty acids here. I think I've got a chart. Here we go. Here's a few fatty acids that are found in dietary sources. I don't know how many there are. There's probably like hundreds, but at least 100 is what I'm pretty sure there are. And there's some really weird ones out there, but these are kind of some of the really common ones. And if you take a look at these structures here, by the way, these are abbreviated structures. They don't show the carbons and hydrogens. But for example, right there, every joint on these stick structures represents a carbon attached to some hydrogens. You can look up the full structures if you want. Usually these things are available on Wikipedia and other places. It doesn't really matter. But I want to show you and make some points about this slide. First of all, you may notice the second column, it says abbreviation. For example, this first one, lauric acid, says C12-0. So that means it has 12 carbons in it. And as we go down the column, you can see we're getting more and more carbons. So the general trend is that, I wish I had a place, maybe I'll write it up here. So the general trend is this here. More carbons, we'll say, is equal to being more solid. So the more carbons you have, the more likely you are to be solid at room temperature. But you can see that if you look down on the list, some of those higher ones are not solid. So probably wonder what's going on. So that's kind of a general trend, only if you compare things that are exactly identical but have more carbons. The bigger trend is this here. So you're probably wondering what that is. That is something called a double bond. And something that has a double bond, so double bond, we call that unsaturated. And again, that's sort of a chemistry term going around to looking at the number of hydrogens, because the saturated ones have the maximum amount of hydrogens that can be put into that chemical structure. Things with double bonds have less hydrogens, so therefore they're unsaturated. And so the bigger trend is this. The more double bonds equals more liquidy, say. Liquidy. Is liquidy a word? Anyone know? We'll just say it is. We can make up words sometimes, can't we? Everyone understands what we're talking about. I feel like there's something else I was going to say about this one here. But so you can see that if you look on this here, pretty much I'm looking at this in every single compound here where the double bond is liquid at room temperature, and every single fatty acid here that does not have a double bond is solid at room temperature. So this is, we're kind of distinguishing right now already between fats and oils. And that's kind of like, that's the thing, right? And the other thing we can say about these is generally, not always, but generally, these unsaturated ones, the ones with double bonds, are generally from plant sources. And the saturated ones are kind of more generally from animal sources. Now, that's a very general, loose rule. If you take a look at the sources of these things, for example, the lauric acid is from palm kernel oil. And in fact, this list, the only animal oil they have is from the liver, which is the bottom one. But kind of generally, fats from animals are more likely to be saturated, is kind of the general trend. And that's something we'll definitely talk about a little bit. So if you take a look at this is kind of a much more basic structure or cartoony structure or whatever you want to call it of the saturated versus unsaturated. And the unsaturated, sometimes we even classify them even further. And so, by the way, there are acronyms for these, which are in the notes somewhere. Saturated, SAFA, saturated fatty acids. And so sometimes you see that in the literature, people using that kind of abbreviation. There's also the monounsaturated, so I think it's MUFA and PUFA. So monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. And so sometimes these are, like I said, kind of broken down into further groups for various reasons. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit later. But one thing to know about the saturated, that's the one on the left, is that if I were to have more of these, they kind of stack really well. So that's a very bad diagram, but hopefully you get the idea. And when things stack really well, they are more likely to be solid. Whereas the unsaturated, you can imagine they're more, how shall we say it, clumsy chemical structures, and they don't stack well and they slip around a lot easier. And so that makes them more liquidy. That's kind of a big thing to know. So which has the highest melting point? That would be this one here, more likely to be solid at room temperature. Just for some context here, something we're going to talk about. I'm not sure if we're 100% we're going to get into this today, but you're probably wondering, let me just take a look at the next slide here for a second. Hold on. Yeah. In terms of these fats, you'll see often with certain oils like olive oil and canola oil and things like that, in terms of it'll talk about what kind of fats are in them. And both of them have monounsaturated fatty acids. Canola oil also has polyunsaturated fatty acids. And they'll talk about these things being good for heart health and whatnot. And so we'll kind of get into that a little bit later, hopefully today. So I just wanted to show you one more slide, just in terms of naming these things, just to show you how complicated this is. And I'm not concerned that you know all the names of the fatty acids. In fact, there's two that you should know, and we'll get into that much later here today. But they often have common names, and sometimes they have more than one common name. Sometimes people talk about the numbers, so the abbreviation, and I showed you before how it's like 18:1 or 16:0, and sometimes we're trying to distinguish where those double bonds are. If you're an organic chemist, you're going to name them using a systematic chemistry nomenclature, and so on. And then there's this cis nomenclature, which is sort of has to do with this omega stuff and all that. And we're going to talk about omega fatty acids here shortly. So just give me a moment here, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I know some people are probably thinking about that a little bit because, of course, omega fatty acids are in the news all the time. So we'll get to that in a second. Oh, sooner than I thought. I thought I was a few slides away. So naming fatty acids. In terms of the dietary industry, you see this whole omega thing all over the place. And I'm seeing this on the products everywhere. I saw, what did I see the other day? I saw it was eggs, I think. And it said something, it said omega eggs or something like that. And it's talking about how these eggs were, and I didn't really actually take a very careful look at the package. They're either enriched or something with omega fatty acids. And I've seen milk, I've seen soy milk, I've seen all sorts of products that talk about these things. And often they'll have a little heart symbol, implying that it's good for your heart, and sometimes other claims. And I think there are legal things you can say about these, and some things you can't say legally, and that's something I have to look up. But what does this all mean? So omega, you may know that omega is a Greek letter. So we're learning a little bit about the Greek alphabet with this pandemic. It goes alpha, beta, gamma, there's omicron somewhere in there in the middle, and then omega is the last letter of the alphabet. So you may have heard of people talking about the alpha and omega. They mean the first and the last, and so omega is last. So if I were an organic chemist, and I do have some organic chemistry background, over here, this would be carbon number 1. And this would be carbon number 18. So we've got the first, which is the alpha carbon, and the last, which is the omega carbon. Those are the Greek symbols for alpha and omega. And so what they're doing is they're looking at where the double bonds are. So if the double bond is 3 carbons away from the end, it's an omega-3 fatty acid. Right, so maybe the name should be a little longer. It should be omega-3 double bond fatty acid or something like that, but hey, that's kind of complicated. So we'll just call it an omega-3 fatty acid. So you might see the symbol, omega-3 fatty acid, but most people are spelling it out because most people don't know what an omega symbol looks like, but I do. And there's also omega-6 fatty acids. And those are the ones that we talk about a lot in terms of heart health. And that's something we'll get into a little bit later. So just keep in mind, I'll mention them a few times, and then let's talk about heart health here at some point here. I think that's kind of all I was going to say about the fatty acids for now. Like I said, there are many, many of them. They have all sorts of different properties. And if you Google omega fatty acids, usually you come up with these ones here as being on that list. So on that previous slide, you saw we had linolenic acid, and there's a linoleic acid. I don't like those names because I get them mixed up all the time. But there's a couple others that seem to always end up on these lists. And usually when food claims are saying there's omega fatty acids in there, they're talking about one of these 5 here. There's also this arachidonic acid, not from spiders. Actually, I don't know what food it's from. And then there's these 2 here, EPA and DHA, which are abbreviations for, let's see here, docosahexaenoic acid and eicosapentaenoic acid. Anyway, and some people take supplements for them, and we'll talk about those as well. So let's kind of get back to food a little bit, and I want to talk to you a little bit about digestion as well of fats. If you take a look at this is showing kind of the breakdown of some common foods, and you can see, like what I said here, animal fats are way up at the top. In the animal fats here, right, we have these saturated, so saturated SAF, saturated fatty acids, right? Big part of those foods. And again, depending on the food of what you're looking at. Now, notice coconut oil is up there. Okay, coconut oil and palm oil are plants. So there's always exceptions, and this is how the real world works. It's complicated. There's always exceptions. Coconut oil was being heralded as a miracle superfood a few years ago, and then eventually people started to point out, okay, this is really high in saturated fats and it's really fattening. And so these are the ones we're trying to eat in moderation by far. What we're trying to do is basically, go down the list from the top to the bottom, and as we get towards the bottom, we're getting healthier and healthier fats. And so we're looking at these things here, these polyunsaturated, right? So what was that? PUFA. And then we've got these omegas down here at the bottom, which are all really good for your brain and heart and things like that. And so, like I said, this is the message you're going to get from this, is we want to kind of, eat all fats in moderation, and we want to kind of, we want to shift our balance of fats to that unsaturated, and include a healthy dose of those polyunsaturated, especially some of those omega fatty acids. So more on that, like I said, when we kind of talk a little bit more about food. This is something too that scientists and historians look at in terms of trying to understand what's going on in terms of human health and those kind of things. And this is kind of the general belief in terms of what has happened in the last few thousand years, is that humans ate a certain amount of fat. And obviously this is not true for all societies. Every society was a little different, but that during industrial times, our fat consumption has increased quite a bit, not quite doubled, and our saturated fat intake has increased And then, of course, we're going to talk about these trans fats at some point as well. And so we'll get into that. And those are really nasty and bad for us. Good news is they've been mostly banned in Canada. So there are a couple other lipids that are worth mentioning. Just going to be very brief about this. A lipid that is very similar to a triacylglycerol or triglycerides are the phospholipids. Phospholipids, by the way, this is glycerol right here. This is glycerol, and those two things there are fatty acids. And then it has only two fatty acids and a phosphate on it. The structure is not important. There's kind of two quick things I want you to know about phospholipids. One is that they are made from triglycerides. So this is why we have to have fat. We have to make our phospholipids because we need them, because they are essential for our membranes. Membranes are an essential part of your cells. Another thing to mention is that some phospholipids are actually used in foods. Phospholipids are emulsifiers. So an emulsifier, you can see I have a definition down there, something that mixes with fat and water. It's kind of a unique kind of chemical. So soaps, for example, and detergents are emulsifiers, and they help to, if you got grease in something, they're helping to solubilize and mix that grease with the water so you can wash it away, right? And so in foods, we can use this, for example, in salad dressings. You may have noticed that some salad dressings are terrible. You have to mix them really, every time you use them, because the oil and the water parts have all separated out. And then some are kind of just everything is mixed and they stay that way. So you can do that by adding emulsifiers to your foods. And phospholipids just happen to be one type. There's a whole bunch of types out there. That's all I'm going to say about phospholipids. Another group of lipids, you can see this is entirely different, are something called the steroids. Now, the textbook is calling them sterols, and it's true that all of these ones we're going to talk about are sterols, but the correct term is technically steroids. Sterols is sort of a subset of steroids, but it's just, details, right? That doesn't really matter. So what is it? It's something with four rings, and they kind of look like that. And there's a whole bunch out there. For example, this one here, testosterone. And I Googled testosterone, by the way, and found this man here. And been staring at this picture, trying to figure out if it's real or not. Every time I look at this picture, I'm like, is it real or not? I have no idea. Could be just some artist drew something on a computer or whatever. But anyway, you can see testosterone there. That's one of the famous steroids. And it's got those four rings. And there's a whole bunch of steroid compounds out there. They all have different biological uses. So let's kind of talk about the two kind of main things that steroids do. Okay, the big one that's important for this class is cholesterol. So you can see there's four rings, and it's got a whole bunch of other carbons and other things on it. And cholesterol is actually essential. And it's not even shown on here. It's actually essential. Oh, no, it does say on here. It's essential for cell membranes. So along with phospholipids, cholesterol is an essential part of animal cell membranes. So we have to have cholesterol. But here's the other thing is, we don't have to eat cholesterol. Cholesterol, we can make it. It's not an essential nutrient. So cholesterol is found in animal products. So butter, meat, fish, those kind of things. So if you're a vegan, you don't need cholesterol because you can make it yourself. But it's important, right? For membranes, it's also important for making bile, and we'll talk about bile a little bit later. You may remember we talked about it a week or so ago, and it's important for making our own vitamin D. So it's a precursor kind of molecule. So this is why steroids are important for this class, because of cholesterol, which is kind of the big one. There are a whole bunch of other steroids out there, by the way. And I mentioned testosterone, estrogen. These are sex hormones. There's pheromones in insects. There's signaling molecules in your immune system, like the cortisols. That one down there at the bottom was solanidine. I think, is that a plant pheromone or something? And I have to look that one up. There's hundreds of these found all over the world, and they're biological signals is what they are. But we're not going to really talk about. Cholesterol is the important one to know. So kind of the bottom line, know that cholesterol is a steroid. It's important for cell membranes. It's important for bile. And it's not important. You don't have to eat it. But we are going to talk about dietary cholesterol as well a little bit later today. So that's another reason why it's important. So by the way, as I mentioned, there are tons of other lipid molecules out there that kind of fit that definition of being mostly carbon and hydrogen and being not water soluble. There's the fat soluble vitamins. So we're going to talk about these when we get to vitamins. And they're very, very important because they're vitamins. There's all sorts of other weird molecules out there. You may have heard of these ones. These are the prostaglandins. And these ones here have a variety of different effects. So in terms of some of them are involved in your pain response in your body. And so I don't know if anybody here is a marathon runner or into sort of endurance sports, but a lot of endurance athletes talk about, they're running or whatever they're doing, and they're kind of in a little bit of pain, and then it sort of goes away, and there's a bit of a euphoria. And that's what these things are a little bit all about. Like I said, they're involved in the pain mediation response. I don't actually know a ton about them, but interesting to look up, and they are technically lipids. But no more on that now. All right, so time to switch gears. I was hoping to have some cahoots for you guys, and I'm sorry, I just keep running out of time on these things. So hopefully we'll have some after the reading week when I have time to catch up on all my work. We're going to switch gears, and I do want to talk about lipid digestion and absorption. So I have a whole bunch of graphics to show you from textbooks and things, but I thought it'd be worth it again to kind of just do a kind of a very basic flow chart in terms of what is happening with the lipids. Okay, so we're going to start off with our mouth. Let me just pull this a little closer, see if I can write neatly, and we'll see how this works. Oh, come on. There we go. Try again. All right, we'll start off with the mouth, and we're going to go to the stomach. There we go. And then we're going to go to the intestine. So you probably knew all that. By intestine, I mean small intestine. That's where most of the nutrient absorption takes place, as we've talked about before. So the mouth and the stomach, there's one thing we can say about this, is it's mostly mechanical. So meaning you're breaking your food up with your teeth. Your saliva has very, very tiny amounts of enzymes in there that might break down lipids, but they're basically not even worth mentioning. Same thing with your stomach. You're just looking at kind of grinding things up, and that's kind of about it that's going on. Now, it's not always true when you're a baby, by the way. Babies are drinking breast milk or other types of milk, sometimes formula and things like that, and they actually have enzymes in their saliva to help break down fats in the breast milk. But that's something that goes away after, I think, a couple of years of life kind of thing. But that's kind of an exception. Like I said, this is how biology works, by the way. There's exceptions for just about everything. Now, it's the intestine that we want to talk about here, and in terms of what is going on. And what happens in the intestine is there is some emulsification. So emulsification. Now, we just talked about emulsification, didn't we? That means you're trying to mix up the lipids and make them more soluble. And how do we do that? We do that with bile. Okay, and I'll show you some images of how bile works here in a minute, just in terms of kind of the mechanism. But remember, emulsification, like I said, it means mixing or making soluble in water, basically, because that's what most of our bodies are made of, is water. So we have to have a way to have those lipids kind of interact with the water and get digested, right? We also have enzymes. And this is a big part of the digestion. These enzymes have a name. They're called lipases. So remember, anything that ends up with ASE is an enzyme, and a lipid is, of course, the molecule we're trying to digest. And so a lipase is an enzyme that digests a lipid. So these enzymes, and it's worth it to kind of expand on this, is what they do is they take triglycerides. So I'm hoping to have enough room here on my slide. Triglycerides. They get broken down into glycerol plus the fatty acids. Okay, that's what the lipases do. So maybe I should have put a colon here. There we go. And now they're almost ready to be absorbed. Bile still helps with this, and bile makes something called a micelle, and so maybe I will put a little note on that. Micelles form with bile. And I'll show you a picture of how that works. Again, we're just trying to, these things are hydrophobic. They're not water soluble. So at this point, they are going to get absorbed by the cells, right? And so let's see here, maybe I'll put the arrow over here, and we'll say absorbed by cells. Maybe I should write intestinal cells. Those are absorbed by the intestinal cells. And the reason why I put that over there is I do want to kind of, here's the disadvantage. What I prefer to have is having a nice vertical piece of paper so I can do this long flow chart. Instead, I have something that's kind of long and skinny left and right. So I'm going to put my arrow over here, and I'm going to continue. And there's one other note to say about this, is that the small fatty acids, so small fatty acids, so what do? They go directly into the blood. So maybe I should put absorbed. Sorry about this cramming things in here, folks. Absorbed directly into the blood. So I don't know if this means with yesterday's announcements, whether we're going to be going directly into person. My guess would be after reading week, but I'm just kind of waiting for announcements from the college. But having an actual whiteboard is going to help me a lot with this. Okay, so that's the small ones. They can go directly into the blood, and maybe we can say that they're going to be used by the cells and whatnot, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. At this point, we're just talking about digesting these things and getting them into the blood, and in a bit we'll talk about the usage of these compounds, right? So that leaves the larger ones. So larger fatty acids. So these ones here, unfortunately, they're too big. That means they can't go directly into the blood. The smaller ones are kind of like, they're not, when we say something's not soluble in water, it's not something that's black or white. It is or it isn't, right? When we say something not soluble in water, it means it's not soluble in water in great amounts. For small fatty acids, they can be soluble in water in small amounts. So these can go directly in the blood, whereas the larger ones, it's too hard. They're just going to stick to things. So unfortunately, the body has a hard time using them, at least at this level in the blood. So what happens is that they reform triglycerides in the cells. I can't spell, glycerides. Reform triglycerides. And these are almost done. I have just enough space. These ones are transported in, here's a new word for you. You may or may not have heard of this word, something called a chylomicron. Chylomicrons. So transported in chylomicrons and into the lymph. And then this eventually goes to the blood. Okay, so that's kind of my basics on this. And I really apologize if this is a little bit of a mess. And I'm just kind of hoping to like I said, give you the basics and then show you the textbook pictures. And the textbook pictures are going to say all this again. And maybe it's more complex and hard to understand, or maybe my stuff is more complex and hard to understand. But I'm hoping to kind of basically just repeat this twice. And hopefully one of these times you'll kind of get the basics. But you can see really it's mouth to stomach to intestinal cells, to the blood. Along the way, they get emulsified with bile. They get broken down into their components, the glycerol, the fatty acids. If the fatty acids are small, they can go directly into the blood. If they're larger, they get reassembled in the cells and put into something called a chylomicron. Okay, so we'll talk about these chylomicrons in a moment. So let's show you what the textbook images are showing. This is not from our textbook. I'll show you our textbook image in a minute. I like this one here because I thought it was a little simpler, right? So you can see it's talking about the mouth, mechanical digestion mixing with saliva, the stomach more mixing and churning, and it is mentioning some lipases that are found in the mouth and the stomach, but honestly, in adults, they are in such small quantities that most of the time people are calling them insignificant compared to what goes on in the intestine. You can see the intestine, it's talking about emulsification, enzymatic digestion, and then ultimately the absorption into the intestinal cells. Okay, so like I said, I like this one because it was relatively simple and straightforward, kind of a 1, 2, 3 punch. Getting down to the cells. Oh, by the way, yeah, I want to talk about this emulsification, right? In terms of what is going on. So this is kind of the idea around, like I said, the salad dressing before. Is you've got the two layers, the oil and the water. And when you emulsify things, they are mixed. And so fats can travel a lot better this way. And in terms of bile, here's bile. And you can look up the chemical structure of bile if you want. It doesn't really matter. But these fat molecules, like I said, they're kind of, you can think of them as oily blobs that are not, they're not mixing with the water. And what the bile can do is grab little chunks of these oily blobs and bring them through a water aqueous solution. And then these enzymes can now grab onto them and break them down. So that's basically what bile is doing. So bile, if you don't remember, is made in the liver, and it's stored in the gallbladder. The gallbladder is just a storage compartment for bile, and it secretes it as you eat meals. All right, so this is the zoom in of what's going on in the intestine. So you can see we've got, there's these large fat molecules here. They get emulsified by bile, and they get broken down. And so they're showing the breakdown right here. So the breakdown, we have our triglyceride is broken down into fatty acids and glycerol right there. And there we go. And so number 3 is to end up in the intestinal cells. So these this critters there in the middle of the diagram are intestinal cells. And if it's a small fatty acid, it's going directly into the blood. If it's a larger fatty acid, you can see it showing here, the larger ones are combined to form these chylomicrons, which we're gonna talk about here shortly. And those end up in the lymph before they end up going to the blood. Okay, so that's kind of, like I said, the breakdown in terms of what is going on with the fats. So it's worth it to talk about these chylomicrons, by the way, and I'll get to those in a minute. This is the image from our textbook, and like I said, I thought it was just a little overly complex compared to those other ones, but you can see it is showing the same processes and showing a stepwise phase. It is talking about the large intestine as well, and the large intestine does not do a lot of absorption of fats, if any, that I know of, but sometimes it does trap things like cholesterol, which can get evacuated often with fiber, right? Fiber will pick up cholesterol and help you to get rid of it in your feces. Okay, so let's talk about these chylomicrons. So what are these things, right? They're lipoproteins. So I don't know if it says there, does it? No, this is a type of a lipoprotein. So maybe I will write that down. This is a type of lipoprotein, and we're going to talk a lot about lipoproteins and health here in a few minutes. Type of lipoprotein. Here we go. So what do we have here? If you look at the structure, it's got a bunch of phospholipids. So it's kind of like a cellular membrane. It's got these proteins. So they're actually called apolipoproteins. Not really important. But what's in the middle? So in the middle we have our triglycerides. And by the way, other fats can be there in the middle as well. So we can also have, for example, cholesterol. If you have it in your diet, you can have fat-soluble vitamins. Fat-soluble vitamins. And there's a bunch of other rare lipids that could end up in your diet. But mostly this is triglycerides and then cholesterol if you have a lot of cholesterol in your diet. And that's what these things are. They're just transporters. Again, those fats are the oily blobs. And so you surround them with these phospholipids, and phospholipids can be transported very easily in water. And so it's kind of just this little carrier. And it's a lipoprotein because it has lipids and it has proteins in it. And this is a chylomicron, and there it goes. And so it's taking the fat, and we'll come back to these lipoproteins, but it's a little bit of a transporter. Oh, I thought this was a little bit later. Yeah, it's complicated with lipoproteins, and I don't want you to get bogged down to all the details here. There's two that we're going to talk about shortly: the LDL and the HDL, and you can see they all have acronyms. LDL is low density lipoprotein. HDL is high density lipoprotein, and we're going to talk about them when we get to diet a bit more. But they all have their different roles. So you can see this is kind of showing what's going on. It starts off with the chylomicrons over here at the beginning. So this is step 1, and they end up in the lymph, which is step 2. I don't really know why things go to the lymph first and then they go to the bloodstream, which is number 3. But basically, these chylomicrons are not really, your normal cells don't really take them in. They're actually pretty large compared to other lipoproteins. So things go to the liver, and the liver is just this center full of enzymes, and it processes all sorts of chemicals, and one of them is fat. So it takes these chylomicrons and basically breaks them down, and can break them down into different versions of lipoproteins. So you can see we have the VLDL, which is very low density lipoproteins. They basically take the lipids from the liver to other cells, right? We have these low density lipoproteins, so LDL, and they kind of do the same thing, but so the very low density lipoproteins, these are mostly transporting triacylglycerides, so tags, whereas the low density lipoproteins is mostly transporting cholesterol. My brain did one of those things where it couldn't remember how to spell for a second. And these are the ones that I wish I had a little bit more room on here, but I know I'm going to talk about these in a few minutes. These ones are known as the bad cholesterol. Got to do something about these slides, make sure I have enough room to write on them. And those are the ones that everyone talks about. When your cholesterol is high in your blood, really they're often talking about LDL, because those are loaded with cholesterol. And that is a huge indicator of a risk for heart disease or stroke, is having a high LDL concentration in your blood. So if you've ever had cholesterol measured, that's one of the things they're looking at. The other indicator they're looking at is HDL. And these also carry cholesterol, but they actually carry it out of the body and to the liver for disposal. So this is the good one. So this is the good cholesterol. Did I spell that right? Cholesterol, yes. And that one, so when they look at cholesterol levels in your blood, if you have high LDL and low LDL, you're at a higher risk for heart attack or stroke. If it's the other way around, if you have a good concentration of HDL and a lower concentration of LDL, then your risk for heart attack or stroke is much lower. So kind of the bottom line to say about these lipoproteins is that the one that's formed initially is the chylomicron, and then in the liver, you may get these other ones formed. I can see there's another one here in the diagram, IDL, which I think is intermediate density lipoprotein. Again, it's all kind of lots of different types, but some of them are carrying cholesterol, and so those LDLs and HDL ones are things that are important for really understanding somebody's risk for heart disease or stroke. And so definitely worth thinking about those ones. Okay, so I want to make another little flow chart here and kind of just talk a little bit about storage and usage of fats. Okay, so let's just talk about that, because of course fats are all about the energy, right? And so you could almost change this to storage and usage of energy. You could change this title to almost, except for we're really specifically talking about fats, right? So remember that we have these fatty acids and glycerol. So I'm just trying to figure out what I want to say about this. Okay, yeah. So let's start off there. We'll start off with these fatty acids and glycerol that we've broken down in the intestine. So fatty acids plus glycerol. Okay, so first thing to say is that this is energy for cells. So cells can take these compounds, they can break it down. Sometimes cells are taking the compounds and making other compounds out of them. So like I said, you can use fatty acids to make cholesterol and things like that, right? So what if we have an excess? So that is the question, right? So if we have an excess, they are going to get turned back into triglycerides. And then these are going to get stored in adipose tissue. Remember, that just means fat tissue, right? So that's kind of really what is going on here, right? So this means this, so this is when we're eating, right? So we eat these things, they provide energy for cells, the excess are going to be stored. So what if we're fasting? By fasting, it means we haven't eaten in a while. It doesn't necessarily mean you're actually fasting for days on end, but it just means that there's no food in your stomach, and that food is not providing any of these things for your not providing any of these things for your blood, right? So basically, this stuff that is stored is going to get broken down. So these are triglycerides stored in the adipose tissue. They get broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. And this is energy for cells. And that's kind of just the simplified version of this. It's all about those triglycerides getting converted back and forth when when the fatty acids are needed. We can break them down. When they're not needed, we can store them as triglycerides. So that's kind of really, I don't know if I should make a cycle or a circle or a cycle on this, but I was thinking of it more in terms of a flow chart for this kind of thing. A couple other things to note about this in terms of the biochemistry, in terms of what is going on. You have to have some carbohydrates available for this process, and in order to break fats down. And if you don't, and this is something we talked about before, you have a very low carbohydrate diet or you're starving, you can have incomplete fat breakdown and you get those ketones formed, and you can get that ketosis effect. And in some cases, that leads to acidifying of the blood and other health effects. And so there's a balance, right? A lot of people are on those ketogenic diets where they're trying to force their body to burn fat. And there is a delicate amount. You have to have some carbohydrates to do it in a healthy manner. And it's something I don't know a ton about. Maybe we'll touch on a little bit later on in the semester. But basically, the bottom line is the body will use stored fat when you run out of fuel from food by dismantling those triglycerides and releasing them into the blood. So there's our little diagram of an adipose cell, and you can see that you've got different foods, right? We have glucose could be a food, we could have fat being a food, and that these are basically stored in the cell as triglycerides, which can get released to the blood if needed. So kind of the summary of the whole thing. And something we're going to touch on in terms of body mass and whatnot. We have a whole unit on that. We want to talk about body mass density and stuff like that. Generally, fat is stored in two main locations. There are other fat stores in the body. I mentioned, we're trying to protect our heart and lungs and things like that. But kind of the main places fat is stored is subcutaneously. That means under the skin, or viscerally. That means kind of around the internal organs, but kind of also around the stomach a little bit too. So we'll kind of break that down. But something that's kind of interesting is that men and women generally store fat differently, right? Men, the bum and the gut, basically, right? Women, those places, as well as the breasts and the thighs, are a little bit more likely. So something we'll talk about a bit more later on. Okay. Oh, yes, and I guess I just already touched on that. We touched on it in the last unit. If you do eat too much sugar, your body is very happy to convert that into fatty acids and store that in your fat tissue. And apparently we have an unlimited capacity to do so. So again, something we want to do is try to make sure we do have things in moderation, of course. Okay. Just doing a time check. All right, 11:30. I think we're in good shape here to talk a little bit about a few other things. Let me just take a quick look at this slide here. I think we kind of said some of this stuff already, so I'm going to move on. Basically, the body stores excess energy as fat. All right. So last part of this unit, we want to talk about dietary fat. And this part, I'm not sure, we're probably not going to quite finish it today. I think maybe the first thing I will say about this is it's complicated. Not all experts agree on all of this, and there's some areas of the science that is very murky, and other areas of the science that is quite clear. And I'll try to highlight some of those things as we talk about this. This is the DRI recommendation, is that you get about 20 to 35% of your total calories from fat. I think the average for Canadians is close to that 35%. So we're kind of in that range. Part of the problem is the amount of total calories. A lot of Canadians are consuming more calories overall. If you look at the percentage of fat in Canadian diets over the last 100 years, the percentage of fat has gone down, but the overall fat has gone up because people are consuming more calories. The other thing I thought that was interesting is the World Health Organization is actually recommending a slightly lower bar, 15 to 30%. So I'm not sure why that is in terms of, why slightly different recommendations, but you can see there's recommendations around saturated fats being less than 10% of your total calories and trans fats being less than 1%. And we'll talk about trans fats in a bit. I haven't talked about them really yet at all. Trying to minimize cholesterol. There's no recommendation in terms of what percentage of your diet, just other than saying, try to minimize it and have a moderation. And unsaturated, the whole idea is we want to substitute the unsaturated fats and use them instead of the saturated fats, right? And especially there's a lot of emphasis nowadays on these omega fatty acids and other certain fatty acids. And there's some of these things are a little trendy. It's kind of hard to say sometimes and tease out what is going on in terms of the science. I was trying to find at this part of the lecture, I was trying really hard to find a nice short good video on this, because there's thousands of videos on YouTube regarding fats and fat science. Most of them are either way too long, or there are people trying to sell things, or there's these self-professed dietary experts that say they know the answer. And I don't like that, because my understanding of reading all this stuff is there's a lot of stuff we don't know about. And or they're trying to sell a diet or something like that. So it was really hard for me to find something. And so I don't have a video to share with you, but you can certainly see what there is on YouTube. They're just, like I said, a lot of people trying to profess that this diet is going to, save your life and all that, and it's complicated. This is kind of this is the table from the textbook. You can see they're kind of giving a little bit more detail on what I said. If you want to take a look at that, you can see they're talking about certain fatty acids. These are the essential ones, linoleic acid and linolenic acid. those are the 2 essential fatty acids that you have to have in your diet. And they're recommending, this much per day and so on. And a few other things around trans fats and polyunsaturated fats and whatnot. Feel free to take a look at it if you're interested. Okay, so before we get into some more specifics, I want to talk a little bit about heart disease. And this is the big one that we're really trying to understand, because there are some things that are very straightforward and other things where there's just so many exceptions that it's kind of hard to understand why we have these exceptions. So there's also research around certain cancers, and this research is super murky. And I'll tell you what we do know around fat intake is that around cancers is that there is a correlation between obesity and certain types of cancers, but not necessarily fat consumption. There is a correlation between red meat consumption, and red meat can be high in fat, and certain types of cancers, but not the correlation between the fats. And so, like I said, this is an area where it's a little more murky. Whereas the heart disease, it's a little more clear, particularly with trans fats. Saturated fats may be slightly less clear, and I'll talk about that in a bit here. And like I said, it's obesity, which is correlated with heart disease and cancers and diabetes. And that's the thing that we really need to beat. How to do it is kind of the devil is in the details, right? So in terms of heart disease, right? Let's talk about that. By heart disease, we're talking about where arteries are getting something called atherosclerosis. So that's where you have a buildup of plaque and debris in the arteries, and they can, and this can lead to your heart or other parts of your body not getting fed enough blood. If it happens to your heart, it's called heart disease or a heart attack. If it happens to your brain, it's called a stroke. It can happen in other parts of your body as well. And so what are the risk factors? So right there, they're listed. High blood LDL and low blood HDL. So we're going to talk about that very shortly. High blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, obesity, physical inactivity, smoking, an atherogenic diet. So what is an atherogenic diet? An atherogenic diet means something that is high in saturated and trans fats and low diet in vegetables, is basically what it is. So it's describing a, fast food diet is really what it is. And also genetics and gender and age are huge risk factors, right? Genetics is huge on this, and being male. So if you're male, sorry, you can't change that. Can't change the body that you are born with in terms of the, certain types of around our physiology. So back to those lipoproteins. Okay, so just a reminder of what these things are used for, and what they are. So these acronyms here, low density lipoprotein and the high density lipoprotein, those are the two I'm going to focus on. Like I said, the very low density, this is mostly transporting triacylglycerides, whereas the low density and high density lipoproteins are transporting cholesterols, right? So let's take a little bit of a closer look at these things. This is kind of a little diagram comparing what's in these things. So notice that the chylomicrons, right, mostly carrying triglycerides. The LDL are carrying a lot of triglycerides, right? So that's percentage, right? So 60%. Whereas the HDL, it's a much lower cholesterol amount and a higher amount of protein. And so these ones are good and these ones are bad. And so looking at blood levels, and trying to think of a way for me to remember this, right? And this is one of these things when you're a student, sometimes you come up with memory mechanisms for things. And so I was thinking LDL, L can stand for lousy, and H can stand for hooray. And I don't know if I spelled hooray correctly, did I? No, I think I spelled that wrong. But anyway, trying to give you some mechanisms for remembering which is which. So technically, low density really means it's light and full of cholesterol. HDL means it's heavy, right? High density for heavy, and it has less cholesterol. Cholesterol is light and proteins are heavy. So maybe that's another way to remember in terms of the density of these things. So like I said, that balance of those in your blood is a huge indicator. How can we change these things in the blood? There's so many things we can say, and we'll talk about a little bit about some of them. Here's just another graphic, kind of showing what's going on, and you can see this atherosclerosis here in the artery, and that's basically a buildup of the bad cholesterol, right? And that's what we don't want. So we're trying to prevent that. Here's another image of the exact same thing, showing these plaques, and on the right is an actual photograph, and thought I'd show that to you. You can see the plaque build up, and of course we want blood to go through the arteries in a healthy way, not in a constricting way. Okay, so I wanted to touch a little bit more on the science in terms of the dietary science about this before getting into some specifics. And we'll see how far we get to this today. If you go on the internet, read books, anything about fats, you're going to see all sorts of graphics like these ones here, right? This one, I'm looking at the one on the right, these recommendations around the fats, and cutting down on the saturated fats. So the trans fats, this is the one that we definitely want to cut down on. The science is really good on that. We'll talk about that. I'm guessing we won't get to that today. But the science is really good on that. Not complicated at all. There are very good studies in animals and humans that show that artificially formed trans fats are really bad for you. They lead to atherosclerosis. They lead to increasing levels of your LDL cholesterol and bad. Saturated fat, this is where the science is a little bit more murky and a little bit more less clear, right? And I noticed this graph doesn't say anything about cholesterol digestion as well. And we'll talk about that here shortly. But generally, this is what the data does show over here, is generally a reduction of saturated fat in the diet reduces the risk of CVD, which is cardiovascular disease. So generally. Now, the problem is some people, they reduce their amount of fat in the diet and then they just eat a bunch of sugar, right? So that's not how it works. You can't just take fat out of the diet and then assume your life is going to be better. You have to be replacing it with the good stuff. So whole grain foods, vegetables, polyunsaturated fats from some vegetable sources, those kind of things. Like I said, this is where it gets very complicated. And so, what's the debate, right, about this whole thing? Is that there's not really a very well understood biological mechanism of this in terms of what is going on. And there's so many exceptions. If you look at native people who traditionally live in Canada's north and Greenland, their diet was a high percentage of animal fat. They were eating seals, they were eating fish. Basically, their almost huge part of the diet was basically animal fat. High percentage of fat from saturated fatty acids. And historically, they did not have a lot of heart disease. So what's going on? Well, it may have something to do with the fish. And that's something we're going to get into when we talk about some omega fatty acids. But there's just too many exceptions like that where you can find people with high saturated fatty acid diets and no issues with their hearts. The other thing is that genetics aspect. Is there is a strong link between genetics and heart disease. And kind of the third thing to say is when we say saturated fatty acid, we're actually talking about probably 100 different compounds. And some of them are probably much better for your health than others. So really the bottom line is they're not bad for you in moderation. And I think that's where the disagreement is in terms of what that moderation looks like. And right now, most experts are recommending 10% of your diet or less from saturated fatty acids, and with less maybe even being better. Just let me see where we are in terms of time. Like I said, it's complicated. Another thing to consider is these trends, right? And I think I had mentioned before about this idea of humans wanting to vilify certain foods, or call other foods superfoods, and it's not the best thing to do. So this is showing what happened kind of in the 1980s, right? The whole trend was, oh, dietary fat bad for you. Okay, let's just okay. So let's make some low fat and no fat products, right? And so there were tons of people that were taking fat out of their diet, and you can see the number of no fat and low fat products peaks here around 1996 or something like that, and the obesity kept going up. So what is going on? It is so complicated, right? And here's the thing, right? Is a lot of people, the amount of sugar consumption in the 1990s spiked. So again, you're looking at something that is, overall calories are important and overall body mass, obesity being kind of the biggest problem here. So like I said, it is very complicated. Let me just take a look here at next couple of slides. Yeah, okay. So maybe I'll just finish off saying a few things about cholesterol, and we'll wrap it up for the day. So what about cholesterol in food? And this is something where cholesterol for many, many decades have been vilified. Way back, I think in the 1930s or something like that, there were some famous experiments where they were taking, I think it was guinea pigs or rats or something, and they were feeding them almost pure cholesterol out of egg yolks, right? And these things were like, their arteries were just in really rough shape. And since then, that was the whole idea, that cholesterol was vilified in humans. Well, it turns out that guinea pigs or rats or whatever they were using are not humans. And it turns out that recent researches in the past 20 years have kind of changed our thinking on that to make us realize that eating lots of cholesterol in your food does not necessarily raise cholesterol in humans. In fact, 60% of people can eat more cholesterol and they can't measure more cholesterol in the blood. So what is going on here? A small percentage of this is the exact opposite. We eat more cholesterol in our food and we end up with way more cholesterol in our blood. So it's, again, probably that big genetics thing, and the overall diet is probably really important. I mentioned that a high fiber diet can reduce cholesterol. So that's probably a big part of it. And but really, when it comes down to it, dietary cholesterol is not the thing. These two things here, saturated and trans fats, are definitely known to raise blood cholesterol, trans fats especially. Like I said, it's complicated, and there's still some disagreement amongst experts on this area. But dietary cholesterol probably should be eaten in moderation, but again, what that moderation is. If you think about foods with dietary cholesterol, so eggs, shellfish, beef, those kind of things, those are good foods. They have lots of good nutrients. So we don't want to just say, okay, we should stop eating eggs because they have cholesterol in them. Eat eggs. Just don't eat 8 of them in one day, and don't do that regularly, right? Moderation is kind of the whole thing. And keep in mind that really the saturated and trans fats, having those in moderation is probably more important than eating cholesterol in moderation. But that's kind of like where the science is leading. So I think I'm going to stop there. Looks like we're out of time. So lots to think about today. I think, like I said, the big message is moderation is good, and trying to shift our diets towards the plant fats, so the unsaturated mono and polyunsaturated fats is kind of the advice, and that's the advice I've been giving you all semester, is trying to make sure we have a healthy amount of fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and having everything else in moderation. So thank you for coming out. I'm sorry if I just blabbed on and on and on. I know sometimes these lectures are long. Hopefully when we do get back to in person, it'll be a little bit of a different experience. But anyway, see you on Friday. Talk about the exam on Friday, and we'll start topic 6 on Friday as well.